My name is Olivia. Welcome to my video about what life looks like for people who are deaf. First question. What if everything I said in this video was all through sign? Can you understand? Maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. But anyway, in this video, I will tell you about different ways people become deaf. How being deaf can affect the classroom. And finally, different lies or thoughts other people may have about people who are deaf. I hope you enjoy my video. Thank you. First, let's cover some causes of deafness. For my video, I interviewed a man who is deaf, and his name is Charles Reed. He helped me understand how he became deaf. Hello again. My name is Olivia. This is my friend Charles. Charles is his sign name. That's his sign name. Charles says hello. Today, I asked Charles to come meet me so I can ask him some questions about what deaf life looks like. First question. How did you become deaf? Charles says, I have a deaf family. Deaf, I was raised deaf. My parents are deaf. My mom made kids. Her first son was deaf. Second, deaf. Third, deaf. Fourth, but my mom, her family history is deaf. My mom has 2 brothers that are deaf. That's how my family generation has gone. My mom had 4 children deaf, 4 hearing. 4 deaf, 4 hearing. That's her children. That's how that happened. My mom's family grew up deaf. A website called Canada.com listed some different ways or conditions that can cause deafness. Things such as ear infections, fluid buildup behind the eardrum, holes in the eardrum, and problems with the middle ear bone can cause deafness from conductive hearing loss. It also says that in rare cases, tumors can also cause conductive hearing loss. They block the sound from getting into the inner ear. Something like what Charles was talking about would be birth defects or genetics. These can also cause deafness. Genetics is one cause of sensory neural hearing loss, and actually half of all cases of profound deafness in children have a genetic source. Just from being around deaf culture and people who are deaf, I can tell you a little bit about some characteristics about them. First is that they will communicate through sign language. This is a beautiful language that uses their hands or hand gestures to communicate to one another. So signs such as how or you can ask the question, how are you? Now, this is such a great language because even people who are hearing can sometimes catch some things. So if I say go, most hearing people can understand go. But also another characteristic would be that deaf people don't necessarily like to use their voice. Now the man that I interviewed for this video does use his voice because he's comfortable with it. Also, he does it to try and help me. But most of them will not use their voice. Although most of them did go through speech therapy, learning how to read lips, learning what the words sound like, even though they can't actually hear them. They do go through that, but they don't necessarily like to practice using their voice because it can be embarrassing for them because something might not come out the right way because they can't hear what they're saying. Next, I wanted to talk to Charles a little bit about how being deaf affected him and everyone else in the classroom. Well, when I went to public school, my teacher taught me how to learn to read lips. All my life, it's been the same. Deaf class would be the same too, but my teacher made me learn how to read lips. That's all I had. I didn't go to a deaf school, no. I went to a public school, and that's all. So I'm always fascinated when Charles tells me this story, because I think it is so amazing that he went to a public school his whole life and always had to read lips without an interpreter. All of his brothers and sisters went there, and like I said before, he had 4 deaf and 4 hearing brothers and sisters, and they all had to practice reading lips. This is another characteristic of people who are deaf. They can always tell what you're saying. Even when talking with Charles, I can just see how great he is at reading lips because it's something that he had to practice his whole life ever since he was a little boy. When talking to Charles about his friends and his teachers, he said that they didn't really help him too much. He said he didn't really have a whole lot of friends that helped him with school. Mostly it was just his brothers and sisters that tried to help him. He said his teachers tried to help him as much as they could with how they could communicate, but it wasn't always the best help. Charles did make it through school, though, and it's all due to the fact that he can read lips. In an attempt to learn more about how deafness can affect the classroom, I went to a website called About Education, and it just talks about deafness and what this looks like in the classroom. It also focuses on those students who have a hearing impairment and what that looks like in the classroom. So it mentions some characteristics of those students who have deafness or hearing impairment, and they will often have difficulty following verbal directions. They will have difficulty with oral expression, some difficulties with social or emotional or interpersonal skills. They will often have a degree of language delay. They will often follow but rarely lead, and they will usually exhibit some form of articulation difficulty. They can also become easily frustrated if their needs are not met, which will lead to some behavioral difficulties. These are all wonderful characteristics of students that might have a hearing impairment or be deaf. But we need to be careful with these students because a lot of teachers will just assume that their student has some sort of developmental or intellectual delay. But it could just be because of a hearing impairment or they can't understand you. And finally, I wanted to end by talking about some psychosocial issues that arise for people who are deaf. Next, I wanted to talk about some psychological or social problems that might arise with those people who are deaf. So I went to a website called Paradise Hearing and Balance Clinics, and they mentioned some social or psychological problems that those people who are deaf or those people who have hearing loss might experience. So some social problems might be reduced social activity or problems participating in social activities, problems communicating with your friends or relatives, problems communicating at work, isolation and withdrawal, or lack of concentration. Now the man I interviewed for this video, Charles, he experiences a lot of these problems. Later in our interview, he informed me of his difficulty to communicate at work because he has to have an interpreter. Well, what if he needs to talk to his boss at a different time and she's not there? Then that brings up problems with his communication. Also, some psychological problems that people who are deaf may experience would be embarrassment, shame, guilt, and anger, sadness or depression, anxiety and suspiciousness, self-criticism, and low self-esteem or confidence. When talking with Charles, he mentioned many times when he just gets angry just because he has to repeat something multiple times, or how he gets angry because other people get angry at him because they can't understand him, and it creates a real problem for him. Some other things that I wanted to discuss would be myths or false thoughts that people think about the deaf community. The first myth would be that all deaf people can read lips. Now, I said before that most people will read, or most people who are deaf will be able to read your lips, just because they've gone through the schooling. And most schools will teach them how to read lips, or they'll get used to having to read lips. But it's not always the case that they will be efficient in reading your lips. The second myth is that sign language is a universal language. There are many different sign languages incorporated into the big Rome sign language. So in Africa, they use different signs for different words than we use in America. Also in Australia, they have a different language under the universal sign language. So sign languages are just as diverse as spoken languages. Myth number 3 would be that being deaf or hard of hearing is an indication of less intelligence. Just like I was talking about before in the classroom, many teachers assume that their students have intellectual or developmental delays just because they're doing bad. But it could just be because that student has a hearing impairment or is deaf. Now, people who are deaf do have the ability to learn and gain knowledge. So just because of their inability to hear, that does not give them an inability to learn or have knowledge. Myth number 4 is that all deaf people can read, so there's no barrier to communication. The words and art of the spoken languages are second language to a deaf person. Being able to read requires the same amount of learning, just like a hearing person, and as sign languages often have slightly different sentence structures and grammar, a deaf and hard of hearing person often will find it hard to read and comprehend fully without extensive practice. So our communication through our voices uses a different way of forming sentences or our syntax or semantics. So it's very different from sign language. Myth number 5 is that deaf people can't drive a car. Deaf people drive cars all the time. In fact, studies have shown that deaf people are actually better drivers than hearing people due to the fact that they have enhanced peripheral vision. If you think about it, nothing about driving really requires you to be able to hear. After all, there's a reason emergency vehicles have both sirens and lights. So myth number 6, all deaf people will benefit from a hearing aid. There are varying degrees of hearing loss, moderate, severe, and profound, as well as other different types of hearing loss. Based on the degree and type of hearing loss, a hearing aid may be of no benefit to someone who is profoundly deaf. Charles is profoundly deaf. A hearing aid will not benefit him. Now, I'm sure you've heard of something called a cochlear implant. This is what, when they put in certain wires that connect in your brain and that fill in those spots that were supposed to be there, or where they, and then there's a little something on your head to help you hear. Now, not all people would benefit from that. A lot of times they don't work. Those are actually a big deal, a big controversy in the deaf community. So there's many myths and many issues that people who are deaf go through every day. Well, that's all. I hope you enjoyed my video about what life looks like for people who are deaf. Thank you.
If we're honest, if we're honest.